Human beings are radically limited.
Capitalism has a monopoly on the freedom discourse.
Like you talk about people not having times to pursue their hobbies. People don't even have the time to find out what their hobbies are.
Yo, what up? Welcome to Owls at Dawn. We are just two dudes from Southern California who studied philosophy, politics, and religion around the world and decided to start a podcast where we could bullshit with impunity. I am Austin Hayden Smith.
And I'm Troy Polidori.
And this week we have on my favorite Omaha Marxist, Brett Anderson O'Shea. His Twitter handle is, I don't even know how to pronounce it because it's something Irish, but Dead Irish Rebel from RevLeft and The Guillotine. And we're going to go over the Manifesto for an Accelerationist Politics, sometimes just called the Accelerationist Manifesto by Nick Cernick and Alex Williams, that advocates for a post-capitalist vision through the use of technology and political and social activity. And so we will get into that. Of course, a reminder that our Patreon account is up. If you would like to have access to the bonus episode as well as the newsletter, you can go to patreon.com. You can get access to all of those things. $5 a month will give you access to the whole shebang as content is continuously coming out. $2 a month gives you access to be able to recommend ideas for future podcasts. We have adjusted things. Troy reached out to me and was like, hey, dude, we had a goal set for if we get 100 patrons, then we'll open it up to polling. He's like, let's stop being so ambitious, dumbass. Come on. And, well, he didn't say that. He said, what if we make it to 25 or adjust it to 25? And so we've adjusted it. So once we get to 25 patrons, then we'll open things up to polling. And that includes both the $5 and the $2 tier. And so right now we are at 10. So once we get to 25 patrons, then we will open things up to suggested topics, unless you want us to talk about Trump all the time. Unless, I mean, we could do a philosophical reading of that shit, I guess, but please be nice to us.
Yeah, just don't be a dick.
That's right. Just don't be a dick. That's like the motto of our engagement. Just don't be a dick, okay? And that's it, man. So before we get into the main segment, you got something important we got to get to. It's the shitty minute. It's the way we start off every episode. It's the moment where one of us gets to get off of our chest whatever it is that has been burdening us for the week or for the past couple of days or something like that. This is our point at which we engage in catharsis.
It's the morning constitution of the podcast.
It is the morning constitution. So Troy, flush yourself.
I'm not flushing myself. I'm flushing this external reality from myself.
Okay, it's the shard. What was Luther's thing? He is the shard that is coming out of the anus.
I forgot about that. That was a great one. Luther was the best with metaphors. So my shitty minute this week is an article in the Wall Street Journal by Walter Sinnott Armstrong, who's a philosopher at Duke who works on philosophy of law, and political philosophy and stuff like that. And this article is called "To Get Along Better, We Need Better Arguments."
Oh.
And did you read this one?
Amy Therese, who was on our Incel episode, for people who are curious, sent this to me, and and I did read this. I did. Yes, go ahead, Troy.
So in the article, as the title implies, Armstrong basically argues that not the problem, but a huge problem in the current political and ideological polarity that we have, right? The sharp distinction we have between right and left exists because we don't follow the sort of standards of good argumentation, like stating our premises clearly and defining our terms and giving our reasons and being respectful of other people who have different opinions and being humble and being candid and all these things, right? It's a pretty traditional argument. It's the kind of thing you hear a lot of times usually from people of extreme privilege, right? And I want to stick a more nuanced claim about this, even though I should be ranting right now. I want to be nuanced.
I think it's the nuanced minute.
Yeah, I know, right? Sometimes you have a nice, comfortable shit. So one, I'll just rant about why the article's in large part just complete bullshit, right? The idea that we're going to solve our political impasse through argumentative procedure is ridiculous. This assumes that making our arguments more clear is going to sort of resolve problems because everybody's in good faith and everybody wants to get to the truth. It assumes that arguments are fundamentally about truth, and they're not always fundamentally about truth. Maybe they should be, right? You might argue that they should be, but they clearly are not in actuality. They're fundamentally, in large part, especially political arguments, about negotiating different interests. They are political, right? They're not epistemological. Now, if you're a philosopher and all you do all day is develop arguments and critique premises and sort of like map out truth tables and whatnot, then maybe you think arguments are fundamentally about truth. But that just shows that you have a very limited position. You haven't considered the way the political reality actually exists outside of yourself, which is clearly the case for Armstrong in this article, right? But that's all true. And that's, I'm sure, the critique that anybody on leftist circles will have of this. That said, I do also want to push back a little bit on the idea that we shouldn't form better arguments, or that in some way we should just reject this idea entirely. Now, it's absolutely true that if an argument is mostly about negotiating different interests, then just making better arguments isn't going to convince anybody to go against their own interests or to change their interests. That's not going to happen, right? At the same time, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't make our arguments more transparent or more candid, or be more respectful of people who are in good faith and who want to learn. Being clear in your arguments and being charitable to people who are in good faith, they're good faith interlocutors. These are all virtues of argumentative discourse, and they're good in and of themselves, but you have to apply them strategically. You have to know when to use them, when somebody actually wants to learn, and you should apply them to yourself because you also want to learn. There seems to be a sort of constitutive character on the left where we all already have our beliefs as if we come fully formed into adulthood with certain interests and beliefs, and those cannot change, and all we have to do is negotiate our beliefs and interests against those of the external world that's forcing on us. And that's just not true. People learn and people grow and people change their interests and they change their beliefs. I myself have changed my beliefs and my interests a lot since the beginning of my adulthood, as you have as well, Austin. So we know this as well as anybody else. And so I want to be open towards making better arguments and being more respectful and charitable when it's strategically appropriate, while acknowledging at the same time that those very virtues of argumentative discourse can become vices when you're actually dealing with an issue that's not about getting to truth, but is instead about negotiating interests. So, for example, in the article, Armstrong uses climate change as an example, which is the worst possible example to use for his point. He says, if you argue that we need a carbon tax to slow climate change, you should admit that you're assuming that climate change is a serious and pressing problem, that higher carbon taxes will not cause too much harm to the economy, and there's no better way to prevent harm caused by climate change. On the other side, if you argue that we should not have a carbon tax, you should admit that you're assuming that climate change will not be as bad as most of the dire predictions claim, and that businesses will not be able to adjust to a carbon tax by developing other sources of energy. He says, when you do this, everything will be resolved. And it's like, climate change of all issues, there is no good faith discourse about that in the public sphere. It's all just people yelling to each other about issues, and then everybody who has any power just using it to continue to socialize the risk and privatize the profits of polluting the atmosphere. Of all issues, climate change is not one where the majority of people are in good faith. That said, there are some issues where people are in good faith, and you should be able to tell when a good faith interlocutor is present and when one is not. That doesn't seem super difficult to do, I think. And that distinction is not a really difficult distinction, is it? Do you think?
I mean, first of all, that was pretty ranty, dude. That was pretty ranty.
Yeah, I changed my tone as I realized I was getting too nuanced.
I like when you get caught up in it and all of a sudden you realize that you didn't think you were going to rant, and then you're like, I'm ranting. I'm going. I like it. This is what I wonder. So I agree with everything you said. So the question is at the same time, is he maybe not trying to suggest that his article is a way of elevating us to overcome our bad faith tendencies? And so we need to have a sort of like theoretical re-education that will allow us to be able to make the discernment between the good faith and the bad faith encounter.
Yeah, I'm sure that's what he intends, but that just completely obscures the political reality of the situation. Climate change, for example, right? Those who have an interest in polluting the atmosphere without paying a carbon tax and then eventually just socializing whatever consequences come from that, that benefits them enormously. They have zero incentive to engage in good faith discourse. It's not just because they've watched too much TV, right? And that's trained them in bad faith discourse, or sort of they've not taken enough critical thinking classes, right? That said, maybe your Uncle Joe, who only watches Fox News, actually doesn't really understand issues behind climate change, and kind of patiently explaining things and trying to make your case clear and asking for his reasons. And then when he's not able to sort of present rational, epistemologically relevant reasons, maybe that exposes something and he realizes that he's wrong. Probably not in a day, but maybe over a long, protracted period of time. That would be good. But we need to be able to negotiate that difference between the public discourse, which is not at all happening in good faith because certain people are benefiting enormously from the way the discourse is sort of perpetrated, and then sort of your small scale private interactions where maybe you can actually present arguments better and be respectful and candid, and those things will be virtuous.
Yeah, I mean, I think that he is presuming a certain understanding of the human subject that I think both of us would find very problematic. And it's what we talked about in the episode with Heidi Matthews about the idea of the presumption of the liberal subject, this idea that you are this reasoning, rational, autonomous entity that knows what you think, knows why you think it, and can access those elements of yourself. Whereas I would say that we are these like radical, complex bundles of confusion and distortion and mystery, and that we don't always know who we are, what we're committed to, or why we're committed to these things. And it's like I want to say to the dude, bruh, you need to read some fucking Freud, you need to read some Lacan, you need to get into the deep recesses of the unconscious, you need to understand structural pressures, you need to understand, libidinal emotional investment into the things that we, Freud calls it cathexis, when you libidinally invest into an object or into an idea. We need to understand those things. And so he needs to engage in a sort of what we would call maybe a critical project, a Kantian project, right? Of going to the conditions of thought itself, rather than just presuming that thought just exists as this easy thing that we can wield in these objective manners. Because, fuck, man, once you start to scrape back the layers a little bit and you realize that it's very difficult to not even to engage, but it's difficult to even think before we can engage, then that really complicates things. And so I just think he has a bad epistemology, we would say, maybe.
Yeah, I think that the improper notion of sort of epistemology and subjectivity is there, right? And it's also the social level too, I think is really off. He's saying to get along better, right? To have a better society, we need to do these things, right? And that, I think, obscures the reason why society isn't good in the first place. It's not because we haven't been clear and transparent in our arguments. Now, that's sort of correlation, I think, and I think both those things are caused by another thing, and that's the political reality, right? And so if the political reality is this, massive inequality, then these are both going to end up being sort of epiphenomenal sort of consequences or results from that. And yeah, that explanation, which is it's certainly not like an esoteric one. That's a pretty popular one in academic circles today. It's just totally obscured and not even sort of given a fair hearing.
I mean, it's tough too and I'm not trying to be overly nice to the dude, but it's when you're fucking immersed in the academic world, and you mentioned this, and you're just used to yourself constantly being like, that's a very interesting point. I shall refine my argument based on this new piece of literature that I just read. I think it gives you a skewed perspective on other elements of the human experience that aren't structured in that same way.
Yeah, and we still want to admit that that's the goal. I mean, the goal is truth. I want to live in a society where I can engage in a process of searching for truth of other people. That's like a philosopher's wet dream, right?
Right.
But to also admit that to get to that society, we need some strategic means, right? And that strategic means is not just assuming it's already the case.
Right, yeah. And that's why I think that we need to engage in a critical project too, because the critical project doesn't just analyze and go, oh, hey, we are sites of confusion and complexity and mystery. But then at the same time, it kind of says, okay, so then what do we do about it? And it gives us the better tools to be able to overcome that. And then I think simultaneously within that, that opens us up to the larger social and political project that says, okay, so then also too, that means that our social and political structures have been affected or infected with that similar tendency of mystery and complexity. So they too can be reorganized, but we again have to do that critical project of scraping beneath the surface level of things and getting to the underbelly.
Yeah, exactly.
This is why people talk about the divide between what sometimes the divide in analytic and continental philosophy. It's because continental philosophy takes Kant seriously. They take the critical project seriously. The continental project is essentially critical at the individual level of subjectivity, and then also at the structural and level of politics. Now, I know that that's a total generalization, and we might not like that, and you might not like that bifurcation, but at the very least, one of the things that's the strength, let's say, of continental philosophy is it's how do you take Kant and his critical project, and I think that's really the leaping point.
Yeah, I mean, analytic philosophers took Kant seriously, though, dude. They just skipped over the first and second critique, went to the third critique, saw analytic and synthetic judgments, and then never stopped talking about
Philosophy nerds. Philosophy nerds. All right, sick. We are going to get into the shit now. This week, as I said at the outset, we've got a guest on from RevLeft Radio, and they're short for Revolutionary Left Radio, and they have a great intro song, and I just recently heard, Brett, that you guys might change the intro song.
Yeah,
what the fuck is up with that, man? I found that band, and I now follow them on like iTunes and shit because of RevLeft Radio.
Yeah.
So
the String Bow String Duo, go check them out. Well, the only thing is like it's a weirdly divisive song. Like I've never heard anybody that says I'm more or less indifferent to it. People actually like it and they get amped up by it, and other people like fucking hate it and they'll like leave comments like, please stop that folk punk shit. But I don't know.
No. We dig it, man.
Yeah.
So tell people a little bit about yourself and about the podcast and kind of where you're coming from.
Cool, yeah. So my name is Brett. I'm a organizer here in Omaha, Nebraska with the Nebraska Left Coalition. And I also host two podcasts. I host Revolutionary Left Radio, kind of a philosophy, history-oriented leftist podcast. And then I also co-host The Guillotine with my co-host, Dr. Bones. I'm a communist. He's an anarchist. We basically cover current events, and it's more visceral. It's more aimed at your heart, and it's more covering events rather than theory and history. So yeah, that's basically me.
Cool. And so this week we talked about it. We're going to delve into something, I mean, I guess it's a little bit different for what we tend to do. It's more like a communal close read of a text. Troy and I are doing a book review at the time, so I guess it'll kind of be like that, but this is going to be a little different because that text that we're doing is dense as fuck, and it's extremely philosophical, and this one is a little bit more, I mean, I don't know, how would we describe it, you think, at the outset? It's just a straight-up political manifesto.
Yeah. I mean, it's called a manifesto, and it has, like, the shortness of a manifesto, the burstiness, like, covering a lot of territory as quickly as possible. But I do think that there's actually a lot of philosophical sort of context that might help inform a reading of the text. Unfortunately, I didn't have all of that. I read the text as a standalone piece, but I do think there might be, like, there's like Deleuze and Guattari references and stuff like that might help fill out some of the implications of the text or some of the historical and theoretical backgrounds. But like, again, I think I read it as, and we'll be analyzing it as, a standalone manifesto.
Cool. And Troy, is there anything you want to say at the outset about this manifesto?
I guess we should first say that anybody out there who's not familiar with the Accelerationist Manifesto, to go ahead and read it before you listen to the rest of the podcast. We'd recommend doing that, although you don't have to do that, obviously. We'll link to it in the show notes. You can also just Google Accelerationist Manifesto, and you'll find it immediately. It's a short read. Will take you about 15 or 20 minutes. And while it's probably more dense than your average reading, it's definitely not going to be a burden to read. So go ahead and do that, even if you feel like there's some things you don't understand or some things you have to gloss over. Do that and then come back to the show. I think it will be much more of an encouraging listen at that point.
Okay, cool. So I guess the way that we're going to do this is we're going to do an overview of the themes and whatnot before we get into the actual text, but then we'll do a section by section. I mean, literally, I'm looking, my copy is 8 pages long. So it's not even 8 pages, 7 pages long. So it's super short, but we'll look through it piece by piece in these, I guess, 3 separate sections. Brett, do you want to start us off? Initial thoughts? What do you think?
Yeah, sure.
I marked some things down that I'm like, ooh, I know he's not gonna like this. That I want to ask you about.
I'm very interested to hear what you thought that was.
Yeah, but before we get into that, what are your overall thoughts here?
Okay, well, firstly, I would like to kind of address the way that accelerationism is used. Now, if you're in this milieu, this philosophical and theoretical milieu, you'll understand it. Obviously, there's lots of context and background to the way they're using it, but I think a lot of times when people use it just sort of in colloquial discussions on the left, accelerationism is kind of thought of broadly as just like making things worse so that the contradictions of capitalism are intensified and we can move beyond it faster. And in some senses, that's at play here, but I think this is a little bit more sophisticated than that. One definition I found is accelerationism in this paper is defined as the idea that any substantive leftist political project should begin from capitalism in its current organization and aim to unleash the latent productive forces within capitalism itself. So it's kind of a way of thinking about capitalism that says we're already in it. There's already tools here. What can we use inside the belly of the beast to kind of transcend it to a post-capitalist situation using the tools supplied to us by capitalism? Does that sound right to you guys?
Yeah, it does. And we should probably distinguish that from what the authors think is the sort of other alternative, what they call folk politics. And folk politics is defined as sort of primitivist and local and direct action oriented and sort of at a distance from things like the state and technology and regimes of power and things like that. So when they're talking about accelerating, it's sort of in a distinction from that sort of politics, which is obviously a lot more popular on the left in recent years.
How would you guys just go ahead, Austin? I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
How would you guys kind of, so like I struggled with defining sort of the tendency this is coming out of. It's certainly, there's some critiques of what I take to be more or less critiques of anarchism, which we'll get into in a bit, but it's certainly also not, orthodox Marxist, it's not Leninist, it's not Maoist, it's something different, but it's on the Marxian end of things. How do you guys kind of think about where it's coming from politically?
I think where it's coming from theoretically, if I can start with that, is that it's building off of some of Marx's developments in like the Grundrisse and in other texts later on, where he does talk about technology and he focuses more on some of the potential expansions of what we would now call automation or machine learning or something along those lines. So theoretically, it's building from that and mix that with a little bit of post-structuralist Deleuze-Guattari, cybernetics, computer technology, linear programming, mix it with that kind of stuff, and you sort of kind of get an idea of where they're coming from. I think that they would say that this actually is, and they do say this at one point, where they do see this as being maybe the flower to the bud of Marx's theoretical orientation. So that Marx is kind of doing chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4 and saying, hey, I didn't get to finish chapter 5, and then these guys are saying, here's what chapter 5 could potentially look like, if that makes sense. Or if it's a play, here's acts 1 through 4, and then they're kind of saying, here's act 5.
Right.
And I think that they would see it in that lineage. I don't think they see it as being anti-Marx. I don't think they see it as being in any way some sort of negation, but rather a sort of positive flowering of some ideas that Marx elaborated.
Yep. I think that's right.
Yeah, I think one way to also understand the comparison here and the use of Marx is through analogy. And they even kind of quote Lenin in the piece to make the point. And it's that in the same way, Lenin in the quotes and the kind of traditional notion of Marx's critique of capitalism is that it's not strictly anti-capitalist, right? In the sense that you need the material conditions of capitalism to be transformed into socialism and communism, right? Rather than just a strict or distinct alternative. And so they're saying in the same way Marx argued that, they're arguing that you need these sort of technological material conditions of current capitalism, 21st century capitalism. You need to use those in order to transform society into a post-capitalist future. You can't sort of just remove yourself from it or act at a distance from it and achieve anything that's actually post-capitalist.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the things that's really hard for people who are smash the state oriented, right? And I get it, but it can seem like, okay, if everything has been conditioned by the logic of capital, if everything is conditioned by the logic of the value form, then everything is fucking rotten because everything is exploitative. And there's no redemptive possibility within those technological devices, right? And I get that. And I think what they're trying to do is come at it from a more nuanced perspective. And maybe and I know criticisms from certain people on the left would say maybe a sort of naive understanding, because that what accelerationism ultimately does is reproduce the very logic of capitalism by speeding it up. And so I think that's are you guys familiar with Eric Olin Wright?
I'm not.
Okay. He is I guess Marxist sociologist, political economist, but he has this idea of these 4 orientations to capitalism. And he says there's smash capitalism, erode capitalism, escape capitalism, and I can't remember what the other one, but it's like tame capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
And so taming capitalism is like social democracy. Escaping capitalism is, sort of anarchist, temporary autonomous zones. Smashing capitalism is the traditional takeover of state power, kind of Leninism, and then eroding capitalism is kind of fitting within this idea that there are points of pressure that we can build out from that will build an alternative while simultaneously challenging the form of capitalism itself. And I think the manifesto fits more within that of those 4 orientations.
Yeah, I find that extremely helpful, and I think you're 100% on point. It is sort of this 4th thing. The traditional understanding is, big tent anarchism, big tent Marxism, and then generally social democracy, left liberalism. And this is kind of a 4th iteration, building off Marxism, but not orthodox Marxist-Leninist in the traditional sense.
Okay. I have a question. So, Brett, you said that you had you've heard about accelerationism as sort of being more that pessimistic, let's just increase the contradictions of capitalism, and it kind of almost has more of a cynical or almost even nihilistic, like fuck everything, let's just burn it down, entropy, and then we'll create from the ashes. Is that kind of what you were more familiar with the term accelerationism?
Sure. I think there's that sort of cruder nihilistic outlook of just, make things as bad as possible. But I think there's also this like pseudo-strategic outlook which says, by like, let's say, I don't know, actively voting for Donald Trump or something, it will heighten the contradictions of capitalism such that the long sort of orthodox Marxist idea of, capitalism will be transcended when it's played out its role on the historical stage. That will be a shorter way of getting there, as opposed to liberalism, which wants to kind of maintain it and thereby perpetuate it, sort of blunt its edges. Accelerationism, in the way that I've sort of come across it in popular discourse, is like intensify the worst parts of it such that people become sick of it faster,
Right. Okay.
Yeah, that idea is very much a burn down the house for the insurance method of getting rich, right?
Sure.
Right.
And I've always opposed it on the grounds that, 1, it's not guaranteed to succeed or lead where you want it to lead, but 2, it's also, rolling the dice on the lives of millions and millions of people, making things worse in the short term for some hopeful long-term goal is really sacrificing the here and now of so many innocent working people that I could never take it as a truly viable option.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I struggle with quite a bit. Like when someone like Zizek comes out and talks about how, maybe Trump will be a good thing because then it'll just give us, it'll build more resentment on the left and help us to build coalitions. And here's the shitty thing. In a way, he was right. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of us would have seen that what he was saying had merit, but at the same time, it also has a sort of a gross logic to it because we're talking about the potential for real human lives to die.
Exactly.
And now I don't know. I heard this in fucking the movie The Big Short, and I work in the field of political economy, so I should know better to not just quote statistics and shit like that based on numbers. But I'm going to quote something that they said, and then people fact check me, let me know, because I haven't been able to find this in like the actual literature. But something along the lines of, for every percentage point unemployment goes up, 40,000 people die. And so the point is that if Trump's economic policies, for example, if they lead to the next huge recession, which a lot of forecasters have been anticipating anyway, right? So if it's something that you know, the tax cuts and the leading to more asset price inflation and stock buybacks, and we have tariffs imposed that are going to hinder real wages even further at home, then that leads to another deep, or let's say a deepening of the deep recession that we're already in. And then percentage points go up to 2 points, let's say, from what they are right now at 3.9%. That's 80,000 people that die, if that statistic is accurate. If it's not, I'm sure there's some correlation, so don't kill me. But the point is that we're talking about real human lives that die based on these theoretical ideas. And that, it just doesn't work with me, even though I also at the same time want to strategize and have a long-term program. So it's finding that balance between the two that's always tough in my mind.
Sure. And I think the form of accelerationism presented here is much more sophisticated, and I think it kind of takes that critique into account inherently. It doesn't outright, address it, but I think it's sort of implicit that that's not the accelerationism they're advocating, and it's something, much more sort of controlled and tactical than that.
Right. Okay. Real quick, we should probably say just a little tiny bit about the authors too. It's written by two scholars, and now they're like really involved with the Corbyn movement in the UK. Nick Cernick and Alex Williams. Nick is a Canadian academic who did research, his PhD at LSE, and now is a lecturer in digital humanities. And then Alex, who I believe was also at LSE, and they wrote this manifesto together. It's actually called a Manifesto for an Accelerationist Politics, but everyone just calls it the Accelerationist Manifesto. And they expanded on this text into a full book that was published by Verso that's called Inventing the Future. And for people who are more familiar with our back catalog, they would know that I am actually directing the film adaptation of the book I'm producing. Isaiah Medina is directing. I'm trying to boost myself up in the credit chain. I'm producing the cinematic. I mean, we could call it a documentary, but Isaiah is an avant-garde experimental artist, so it's not going to be a normal documentary, that's for sure. But it's a cinematic. Is
he avant-garde with the credits too?
Yeah, exactly. No, for billing purposes, we're calling it a documentary because it's more, it's easier to process for potential financiers, and for granting bodies. But it of their book Inventing the Future, and it was called Inventing the Future: Post-Capitalism and a World Without Work. And so a lot of these ideas are in their germinal form here, and they're expanded on in the book. And so yeah, so that's kind of their thing. And then they've gone on from this. Alex has a new book that's coming out anytime soon now that's called Hegemony Now. And so we'll talk about this idea of counter-hegemony and hegemony, I'm sure, at some point in this. And then Nick's newest book was called Platform Capitalism. And then he has a new one coming out with Helen Hester, who's also part of this movement as well, but from a feminist perspective in something that's called xenofeminism. And there's something called the Xenofeminist Manifesto, if people are interested, and it's XENO. And that book is going to be on care work. So that kind of gives you an idea of who these people are, where their work has gone since this manifesto when it was written in 2013. But yeah, so I guess we should just dig into the text now, yeah?
Let's do it.
Cool. Troy, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, so I guess we've given an introduction, right? We can maybe get into. It seems to me that the third chapter is really where the sort of exploration of how you'd go about producing this acceleration away from the sort of dominant folk politics, which is dominant on the left currently. And that third chapter is called On the Future, and they do make this claim that you have these two possible scenarios for the left: the folk politics, when we talked about, away from the state, away from regimes of power, and then the accelerationist politics, which is to preserve the gains of capitalism while transforming those gains into things that are more equitable and new subjectivities, new value systems, new government structures, et cetera, et cetera. And so the basic idea is to present a series of strategies, policy proposals, all the things we can kind of talk about, I think, in brief here, in order to transform these gains of capitalism and transform them into a post-capitalist future. I know one of those is the dominant one that they talk about in the book, Inventing the Future, right, which is the universal basic income. Although it's not very talked about very much in the manifesto.
Yeah, it's like one line, I think.
Yeah, it doesn't occupy a huge space, although it's clearly more central now.
Yeah, so then kind of what they're delving into in this third section is actually starting to put together a programmatic, right?
Mm-hmm.
The first one starts off with, here is, it's called the conjuncture, so here's the crisis. The second one is sort of, they call it the interregnum. It's, okay, we're in this transition between the two, or this is what it would look like to be in a transition between a capitalist and post-capitalist world. And they say one of the big issues is that there's a real lack of political imaginary to get us to the future. So I think the third section really functions as their understanding of what an imaginative and creative alternative to capitalism would be, building out from the existing kind of materials that are already there. So one of the things they say is that we can't go back, right? This is one of the things that you see so many with critics of anti-capitalist sentiment. They will kind of be like, yeah, but look at the tools that we have now, man. I got my iPhone. I mean, shit, we're all over Google Hangouts right now, able to access this interesting text and have a very fruitful conversation because of the tools that capitalism have provided. Yeah. So this isn't some sort of Luddite, let's smash technology, let's go back to Fordism. They say that not only is that not desirable, but it's not even possible. Rather, what we need to do, and this is what Brett talked about earlier, is unleash the latent productive forces that are already there. It's not destroying the material platform of neoliberalism, but repurposing it for common ends. So here's my question. What the fuck is the material platform of neoliberalism that we supposedly can repurpose? And this idea of repurposing, what does it mean? Is it good? Is it going to just reproduce the logic of capital? That's my initial question here.
Yeah. And that's one of my big critiques too, is this notion that it could possibly replicate it. Now, when I'm thinking of the neoliberal material platforms, like, yeah, kind of, I guess what I'm getting is like, it's kind of hard to say, but like just the use of the technology that they've granted us, the use of the mechanisms already in place in the neoliberal world order. I mean, they make a lot out of the fact that technology, you know, even though it's often, as you said, talked about as like this triumphalist way, like look what capitalism provides. Their argument is like it radically actually constrains the pathways that these technologies can take and actually kind of funnels them into like competitive commodity production, competition between capitalists. They have this line about we just get slightly marginally better gadgetry as opposed to really opening up the possibilities of science and technology liberating human beings. And they talk about the work week and how early liberal philosophers and thinkers like Keynes himself argued that if capitalism were able to play out continuously, that the work week would actually shrink, and which is just hilarious in retrospect. So they really talk about the limitations of what neoliberalism can do with the stuff that it's generated. But I was kind of confused about to pin down a definition of what they meant by material platform. Troy, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, really quick. First, I thought a really good example of sort of the limitations of neoliberalism as far as using the gains that capitalism is supposed to bring to us is like medicine, right? Where it's something like 80 to 90% of all R&D in the medical industry or pharmaceutical industry is bent towards taking generic drugs that are already available and making knockoffs that are just different enough to avoid being a generic, which they can patent and then sell for a much higher price. I mean, that's clearly an inefficiency, right? We could be using all of this incredible amount of R&D, both private and public, to make people's lives better and cure diseases and elongate lives. But instead, it's a huge swath of it is bent towards like producing boners and reducing hair loss.
Exactly.
And so, yeah, with that, we have like medical technology. That's the example of one of those material gains, right? Finance, complexity theory, different sort of academic enterprises as well, which are bent towards capital. Which Nick and Alex are arguing, why can't we just use those tools instead for other ends? In the same way Marx would talk about using material industry, right? Factories, and owning those. Why don't we have the social ownership of things like finance and technology? Not material in the same way that a factory is, right? But it is material in the political sense.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. This is Brett was saying earlier, he mentioned Deleuze and Guattari. This is a very Deleuze and Guattarian kind of line of thinking, because one of the things they talk about in Capitalism and Schizophrenia is that capitalism is creative, but only within a predefined set of limits. And the limits are restrained by the logic of capital itself, the profit motive, etc. And one of the things that so many advocates of capitalism try to articulate is that they think that capitalism is driven by this profit motive, which stimulates this endless inventive and creative and innovative spirit. And they love to talk about Joseph Schumpeter, right? Who was this great theorist of innovation. But that's only half the story. Schumpeter actually argues that, yeah, creative destruction is extremely important. However, there are what he calls restrictive measures or restrictive practices that fit under what he called monopoly concerns. And it's exactly what Troy just was talking about. Patents and things like that. Those things actually restrict innovation, because what they're actually intended to do is protect the interests of investors who are already profiting from the status quo, rather than opening things up to genuine creativity and genuine innovation. So there are always these restrictive practices that are benefiting the vested interests of maintaining the system as it currently is.
Yeah.
And so what they're arguing is that no, we could have this like real, almost like flattening out of actual innovation and inventiveness, and open things up to the tools of like open access and open design and the internet and 3D printing and things like that would allow people to circumvent the limits that capital imposes by that need to maximize the vested interests of those who are already rich.
Absolutely, and I would take that in a different direction, kind of going off the idea of unleashing the latent productive forces, all of the material realities of technology and financing and economic models. All of that is true too, but also the other end of that is unleashing the productive forces, meaning unleashing labor, meaning allowing people with less wage labor, with less hours of work. And I think the UBI kind of comes into this part of the argument. By reducing the amount of hours we have to work and how hard we're pressed to the pedal, the creative forces inside the minds of the proletariat themselves could over time be unleashed. And this idea that capitalism is so great because it unleashes creativity and innovation. In reality, sure, it does that for maybe 5, maybe 10% of the population, but for the rest of us, we're forced to go to work every day and come home and wake up the next day and go back to work. And our productive and creative powers as human beings are radically limited. People don't even, like you talk about people not having times to pursue their hobbies, people don't even have the time to find out what their hobbies are. So when you have so much of the population that can't self-actualize because of the material forces of capitalism, well, that's a huge base of possibly productive and creative forces that are stifled. And so a transition over to socialism or communism would unleash that, as well as the obvious things like technology, science, medicine, etc.
That's really interesting, the bit about self-actualization, because that's the fucking mantra, right, man? That everybody tries to reproduce is the be the better you and just boost your followers on fucking Insta, and everyone thinks they're self-actualizing. The question is what is the logic that is conditioning your self-actualization? Are you really self-actualizing in a way that is truly free? And Troy, what was it? You had a great analogy when you were talking about libertarianism, where it's like, you think you're free, but you don't realize that the one arm is still sort of attached. I don't know if it was just off the cuff or if you remember what it was, but I really liked it.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's like, because we were talking about freedom under the logic of capital, and that so many people think that, yeah, man, I'm free, but what they don't realize is that there are still ideological constraints, unconscious constraints, structural constraints. And so they're free from, I don't know, monarchical threat. Sure, yeah, you don't have to worry about some fucking king coming into your town. Well, some people still do, but it's not as common.
Some people do.
Yeah, some people still do. Eminent domain is a fucking thing, and then in other places around the world, but it's not as common to worry.
Us three white guys don't have to worry about that. But.
Yeah, it's often, yeah. But regardless, even if that worry is mostly kind of diminished, you're not absolutely free to self-actualize, like Brett just said. You're free to actualize capital, and you're free to actualize the demands of the market. So you're free to go and be a better tech bro, not necessarily to go and be an amazing tech innovator.
Yeah.
And do something that is truly useful for the social benefit.
Yeah, I think it's really important to situate freedom in that way, because traditionally, capitalism has sort of a monopoly on the freedom discourse,
Right.
or the use of freedom as a positive, as itself as the positive proponent of freedom, and doesn't have to be accepted at face value. The idea that you're forced to go out and sell your labor based upon whatever is available, and socioeconomic conditions not of your choosing, actually paints the picture as sort of a reduction of freedom. And it's a good idea, I think, for the left to instead promote itself as the true arbiter of freedom. We're going to give you the means to which to then be able to actualize yourself into whatever it is that you want to be, to have the time and the resources necessary to figure out what you want to be.
Exactly. And I think that's a project that we should pursue, is this reframing of freedom and saying, no, freedom is not the, exclusive domain of the right and of capitalism. We actually have a far more robust notion of what freedom is. Their freedom is a negative freedom, right? Like the don't tread on me flag is an encapsulation of negative freedom. Like, the freedom not to be messed with, the freedom to be able to, not have your private property, quote unquote, taken away from you, etc. But what the left should argue, and I think the authors of this piece would be totally in line with this, is that, freedom is much more than that. And you don't have the freedom to truly live your life in the limited time we have on this planet when you're forced by forces way beyond your control, whether they're actual, wage labor, or even just the forces of chance when it comes to what parents you're born into, what cultural and historical conditions you're born to, etc. That freedom is much more robust. And actually, we're the people that defend real freedom. And the freedom offered by the right or by the centrist is a false, limited, sad caricature of freedom.
And it's not even just like, lefty ranting nonsense. This is some basic psychology too, right? I'm thinking of like the paradox of choice that psychologist Barry Schwartz talks about. And that when you have the capitalist notion of freedom, which is you can sort of, spend your accrued capital in whatever way you want on the goods that are available. You walk into a grocery store and you see 100 different kinds of toothpaste. And that's the ultimate source of freedom, is being able to choose which of those 100 toothpastes you want. That actually is psychologically debilitating.
Yep.
That's not freedom. It actually makes us suffer.
Interesting.
So reconceptualizing freedom and choice in this new way that actually fits what we know about human beings, even at the more basic, psychology 101 level, is absolutely something that we should do.
Yeah, that's something that I think is so interesting. So I've been reading a lot of this philosopher named Byung-Chul Han lately, and other kind of studies around neoliberalism or late capitalism or postmodernism, or whichever moniker people like to employ to describe our current epoch. But one of the things is that you would think that after the financial collapse that there'd be much more skepticism to capitalism across the board, and there is within certain pockets. But at the same time, there's also a sort of reinvigorated commitment to the logic of state capitalism or late capitalism, right? There seems to be almost like a deeper embedding of our libidinal investments or our emotional investments into the potential that capitalism will still save us. And that, yeah, that was shitty, but it was just the corruptions within the system that led to the problem. Or we just didn't see it because we didn't have good enough forecasters telling us how we could circumvent these potential problems that would come. But now we have the correct monetary policies in place because Janet Yellen and the rest of the Fed figured it out, and so now it's just been passed on to the new chair, and we've got this slow rate of inflation that is gonna, delay it, and it's been 10 years, and we're good now, we're good, and it just shows how deeply ingrained the logic of neoliberal capitalism is within let's say, the majority of, and I don't know if it's the majority of voices. I don't know in people's hearts if they're sitting around at dinner and they're like, fuck this system. But nevertheless, there's an ideological control that seems to be almost more intensified after the financial crisis than we would think, because it seems like, well, dude, it's totally irrational. Clearly, we've experienced a heightened contradiction, the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. Clearly, that should shake us from our slumber, our dogmatic slumber, but it's not. If anything, it's only like re-embedding us deeper. And so I think there's something really interesting about that as well, is trying to deal at that level of psychology, or to deal at that level of the unconscious or the structural. That's like, okay, it isn't just easy to be like, yo, this is irrational, wake the fuck up, dummies. It's something much more than that.
Yep, absolutely. And, when you're talking, I had in my notes the concept of capitalist realism. And we had this episode of Mark Fisher's book from Zero Books. It's a whole book called Capitalist Realism. It's only like 80 pages, but it basically outlines and tries to analyze what Austin just said there, which is, one of the famous lines is, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine capitalism. And that wasn't true in the wake of, let's say, the Great Depression in the 30s and 40s, when you had a huge, you had the Soviet Union, but then you had, really powerful communist organizations and groups all over the planet, really. And there was very much alternatives on offer. I think part of it, and I don't have all the answers, part of it is certainly the defeat of both communism and fascism in the 20th century, although both are coming back in a really real way, and the sort of period of boom in the 80s and 90s, which gave rise to capitalist triumphalism. It really ingrained in people's minds that, this is the best of all possible systems, and all we have to do at this point is just kind of manage it, blunt its edges, and things will continue. And, that's passively absorbed in popular culture. It's passively absorbed in our music, and in the way politicians talk, and the way we're taught school, and, in school. But it's a very real problem. And at the end of that book, Mark Fisher tries to find, some ways out. And he doesn't offer all of the options, but it's certainly something we have to think about, because a big part of the problem we're in, and they talk about it in this manifesto, is a lack of imagination. And the left is kind of, parroting or reframe or sort of acting out these older forms of protest or resistance that have been proven to, at least up to this point, not really have fully worked. And so that critique is also embedded, in the background of this paper, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting. Brett, do you have a religious background at all? Like, did you, I don't know much about, I haven't heard you talk about that.
I was raised in a sort of non-religious, but like a religious, so there wasn't one way or the other. And then I went to Catholic school in middle school and 2 years of high school, and then I had like a weird new atheist phase in my late teens, early 20s. So there's like Catholicism, I guess, would be a force.
Okay, so Troy and I have a pretty extensive evangelical Protestant background, and one of the things that Protestantism would always pound into our brains was that the Protestant Reformation was the realization of true Christianity that had been lost by, no offense, Brett, but the Catholic Church. You guys fuck that shit. but that's it. The Protestant Reformation was the reclaiming of what was lost. And they use all kinds of things, like the reason that the Dark Ages existed was because Protestantism, or the true spirit of the gospel and the Holy Spirit, had receded into the past, and that there were dark forces that were really in control, which they would map onto the dominance of the Catholic Church in a lot of ways, right? And the thing I'm reading, when I'm reading this, I'm reminded that this logic of neoliberalism that is so embedded into people's minds, part of the reason that it has this strong affective control, this capitalist realist logic, is because it's billed as being the true culmination of capitalism by so many people. That, like, this is it, man. We've figured it out. This is the end of history, as Fukuyama said. We've got it. This is what social relations are supposed to be. Not just this is what capitalism is supposed to be. This is the pinnacle of human society.
Yeah.
This form of financialized, deregulated capitalism, if this would just be able to flow even more freely, then we would have more prosperity and more progress. And so the logic isn't irrational at all. It is totally rational in what it's seeking to do. Now, we might say there are inherent contradictions and that there is an irrationality to it. Marx would say that the very value form itself is irrational, because it covers over these contradictions of social relations, the exploitative social relations in the wage relationship. But the logic of capitalism very much proceeds as though it's rational, and people take that on as like, that's right.
Yeah.
And so it almost creates the conditions for an even deeper investment into this idea, because you're like, oh fuck, this is the pinnacle of what it means to be human. So like, why would I not want to completely advocate for free trade? Because man, I got a badass cell phone and I'm able to go to the movies on a Friday night with my girl, or I can go get a pint with my homies, or whatever it is. They feel that freedom at a more kind of deep personal level.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you were saying, it's not even just this is the best society we can do. The argument that you hear all the time is that capitalism is just human nature. Like it's actually, it's part of the ontology of the cosmos itself, or just the very nature of who we are as organic beings. And that is such a absurd claim, but yet it's tossed out so casually, like it's just common sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just say it's obviously ideology in that sense, right? Because it's not a thing. It's a thing you say because it's accepted as being real and that there are no alternatives. But no one actually acts like that in everyday life. If you did, you'd be kind of a psychopath,
yeah,
right?
For real.
No one acts in their friendship relationships or in their family relationships like they do under sort of normal capitalist relationships. I mean, 80% of people would give up a raise to see their immediate boss fired. Right? That's the great poll that was released a couple of years ago.
That's awesome.
And that just shows you that this is a hateful relationship that people have when it's governed entirely by what you can produce and a wage earned for it.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's very clearly not human nature, but so it has to operate as this ideology which sort of disciplines you into believing it.
Yeah.
Right.
And
okay.
I think
so,
one last thing.
go ahead, Brett.
I think the huge rates of anxiety and depression and addiction and the drug epidemics that we've been faced with in this country and beyond, I think they all speak to that point that like if this really was a manifestation of human nature, why are so many people so miserable? And that's a contradiction at the core of that basic claim.
So then what does this manifesto offer, do we think, in concrete terms? We've talked about, this idea of using the material platform of neoliberalism. So using technologies, using medical devices, using the tools of open access, open design, things like that. I mean, is that kind of what you think, like what is the political program here?
Well, they offer what they call three medium-term concrete goals, which I really like because I like the idea of like, okay, we've given our analysis, we've given our critique, we've outlined our basic approach, and now here are some things that we can actually actively start working on building. And this is, one of I think the highlights of this piece because it's practical in an interesting way. But their three core goals are intellectual infrastructure, which we can maybe talk about what exactly that means, but the way they talk about it is basically like it's outlining a new ideology, a new project. It's like studying new economic models. It kind of makes me think of the formation of think tanks, like a way of like technocratically addressing the problems that we face and sort of, finding institutional solutions for it. The second one is what they refer to as media reform, which it's kind of interesting because they say social media and the internet are limited and that we should be investing in quote unquote mainstream media and communication. I'm not exactly sure what they mean by mainstream because that term is shifting as the internet itself takes over, but we can get back to that. And then the third thing is institutional class power, is finding ways to sort of organize a proletariat that's been tossed to the sides, that is now in a gig economy, that is in a precarious economy, that a lot of us don't have union representation. A lot of us operate in the service industry, and so there's this new proletariat that we have to figure out how to organize. And maybe we can learn from the past, but some of the older 1920s, 30s, 40s form of organizing labor is kind of passé, and we got to think of new creative ways to organize the proletariat as it exists today. So those are kind of the three big steps, but maybe we can dive a little bit deeper into them.
What do you think of the third one, Brett?
What was that?
Because what do you think of the third one? Because this was in my notes.
Mm-hmm.
The idea is that you and on The Guillotine, you and Dr. Bones talk a lot about workers, organizing, maybe what they seem to criticize as being outdated in some ways, like the typical ideas of direct action and protest and things like that. They seem to be a little bit negative towards that. I know that this is when you asked earlier, or I don't remember if we were recording or if it was before we started recording, I said there are some things in here that I thought that you might have a problem with. This is one of those areas. So what do you think about that criticism and then the suggestion? And yeah.
So, I mean, it's tough because, one, it's limited, so they don't really get to flesh out their argument. So I would like to question them on what exactly they mean by some of this stuff. I took a lot of their critiques of like direct action and relentless horizontalism. You could take them as like those should be discarded, or you could take them as those are very limited. They might serve a role, but ultimately they're not going to do it in and of themselves, and we should think outside of that box. Because in another part of the piece, they argue for what they call an ecology of organizations and a plurality of forces, and they kind of diss the idea of sectarianism, and they call it a death knell, which is powerful words, and on some sense, like that also recuperates the idea that some people are going to take part in direct action, especially when it comes to, say, fascism, fighting fascism. Direct action is an essential tool in the toolbox, but maybe what they could be offering in a way that doesn't necessarily discard one for the other, but brings them together is okay. That's fine, but it's super limited. So in what ways can we find to go forward, incorporating the best of that stuff, but also not letting it just become a habitual pattern that we get bogged down in? Again, they don't really go deep into what they mean by this. They talk about combining forces and trying to organize in a unique way, but I'm really not sure if it's because it's so short and because it's not fleshed out. I'm not exactly sure what the argument is and how much against the grain it goes to my own approach to politics, if that makes sense.
Yeah, this is my huge question as well. In the third chapter, the 7th paragraph, Nick and Alex are sort of distinguishing or distancing themselves from sort of techno-utopians who think that technology is going to automatically produce like social equality and stuff like that. And they're saying, no, we don't believe that. But we do think that technology has to come before politics in a way. They say this, and I can quote, "Technology should be accelerated precisely because it is needed in order to win social conflicts." So they're not, I don't think, it seems like technology and politics are on equal levels and both have to work together and sort of co-determinative or anything like that. They seem to think that technology is sort of necessary for political and social conflicts to be won. And I don't really know what that means.
Exactly. Yeah, I struggled with that as well. I'm not exactly sure what they're saying there. Technology is a very big word, and they don't exactly say how we can operationalize or instrumentalize that technology. They just say it should be, accelerated, as you said, precisely because it's needed to win the social conflicts. But Austin, do you have any insight on that front?
I think that we need to understand where they're coming from ontologically.
Okay.
And I know that this could get a little wanky, so bear with me, but both of them have been really influenced by Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari and cybernetics research and what we might call a monist framework of thinking. So there is just one world of existence. There's one plane of material, immanent reality. One of the potential consequences of that would be that there's only differences of degrees, not differences in kind. So technology and socio-political action are co-constitutive. They can't truly be defined in any sort of radically meaningful sense. So everything then is a technology. Language is a technology. The tools that we use in the crude sense, like a hammer, is a technology. And then, of course, so too is something like this crazy complex web of information technology, the internet. And that they're just differences of scale or differences of degree or differences of complexity. And so I think that my confusion is I think sometimes they make it seem like there's a distinction between the two. So, they say like technology and the social are intimately bound up with one another. But at the same time, they say that never believe that technology will be sufficient to save us. Necessary, yes, but never sufficient without socio-political action. So the question is, are they making the distinction between the two, or are they, because then the next sentence is the very one where they say how they're intimately bound up with one another, or are they saying we should overcome that duality and recognize that socio-political action is a form of kind of technological activity, just like technology is a form of socio-political reality, let's say. And so this kind of reminds me actually of Weber and his criticism, and then the Frankfurt School and the criticisms of rationality, particularly Weber's criticism of instrumental reason. And in a very simple sense, there's this idea that what you get with Plato and whatnot is this split of logos from mythos. Logos being reason, mythos being narrative, mythological story, maybe sort of a deeper appreciation for the connection with nature, a sort of more holistic form of thinking. Logos is this separation of the word. It's the praising of reason. And Weber would criticize capitalism now, almost 2,000 years later after Plato, by saying that capitalism is the sort of pinnacle of the separation of logos from mythos, that no longer is there a seeking of the good, no longer is there a grounding in the community. What we just get is pure technological reason, this pure instrumental reason. Things are only reasonable or rational or valuable insofar as they are fitting within this matrix of, let's say, means end, technological, technocratic reason. And I think what Nick and Alex are doing here is they're trying to circumvent that criticism by saying that, no, you can't actually even make that separation between the logos and the mythos, or between technology and the social, but that they are essentially the same. So whenever we build a new product, that there's a social value that's in that product. We just don't always recognize all the social value that's in it. We only recognize the value that can produce a profit for the capitalists, at least under the logic of capitalism. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. So I guess I'm kind of struggling with, so what would it mean for the technology to serve, or, needed to win the social conflicts? Are they kind of arguing for some sort of institutional, big, with think tanks invading the healthcare system, invading finance, and sort of building up an institutional organization, and then the sort of direct action and people in the streets can operate in such a way that it's actually helping bolster the other, and in a back and forth relationship? Because without that broader organization, these forms of street fighting or direct action or horizontalism are kind of, they're rudderless. They can't go anywhere because they don't have the organizational weight and structure to actually combat capitalism at a higher level, and so they're just kind of reduced to street movements, protesting, blah blah blah. I don't know. I'm kind of lost there.
Yeah, I think you're right, Brett. That seems to be the most logical place to take it, right?
Okay.
Is that if direct action means old school protests, then it seems like Nick and Alex were saying it's not going to work because you're not utilizing the current technology. That's sort of been removed from having any efficacy. Look at the Iraq War protests. I'm sure they'd look at that in 2003 and say the largest protest in the world, and President Bush just came out and said he was so proud that he lived in a country where that could happen.
Jesus, yeah.
But at the same time, I do still have this worry that theoretically I get why we can understand that technology and political action have a much stronger confluence and shouldn't be separated. I get that, but I think there's also a sense in which we can see a very stark contrast as far as our available futures between technological progress and political progress, and you can have one without the other. In fact, you can have them working against one another. And I think Nick and Alex do admit that several times in this paper and in this manifesto, but I really think that needs to be brought out into a greater light. Are you guys familiar at all with Peter Frase's book, Four Futures?
Yeah, I have it.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite books of the last couple of years on sort of the political imaginary, and he represents four possible futures for us, hinging on technological progress, where she sort of sets into a binary of abundance versus scarcity, and then political progress, which hinges on the binary of equality versus hierarchy. And of course, there's degrees between them, but just for the sake of simplicity, it's these sort of four possible futures. And so the best one is communism, where we have abundance, technological abundance, and equality at the political level. And so we all share our resources and everything's great. But then we can also have the sort of reverse of both of those, which is the worst kind. He calls it exterminism, which is scarcity and hierarchy, right? So climate change wrecks the earth, and we're going back to like feudal political organization. So it's the worst possible future. But it's those two in the middle, probably more likely, which are, what if we had technological abundance, but then still had the political hierarchy? That's sort of the bad accelerationist future, I guess, and that's rentism, where we're living in almost like a feudal society, even though we have abundance and we could easily live in a much more socialized communist future, or what he calls the socialist future, which is that we have scarcity, we didn't have the technological progress we thought we'd have, but we did achieve some sort of equality. And so while things are more equal, our lives are worse. We have to share sort of the burden of the suffering rather than having great inequality between them. And so understanding those four futures as all kind of equally possible, depending upon where we go with technological progress and where we go with political organization, seems to me at least to be a much better array of possible futures. Whereas I even noted here in chapter 3, paragraph 23, Nick and Alex say, the choice facing us is severe, either a globalized post-capitalism or a slow fragmentation towards primitivism, perpetual crisis, and planetary ecological collapse. So it kind of seems like they see it as two futures, right? The communist future, right? And then the sort of terrible exterminist future. And it seems to me introducing the other two options puts a much better view on what we can do, because we could have technological progress without political, and vice versa.
Yeah, and when you were saying that, which I think is a great point, it reminded me of, we're all into film, I think, to some extent. Sci-fi seems particularly like modern sci-fi projecting into the future, and even, from the 80s onward, Blade Runner, RoboCop, etc. They seem obsessed with either rentism or exterminism. It seems like sci-fi broadly has a tough time conceptualizing the other two options. So you'll get like a lot of post-apocalyptic stuff, or you'll get a lot of cyberpunk in the future. There's massive inequality. People have flying cars, but there's still billboards everywhere, etc. So I think that's an interesting sort of side note to those possible futures. But then I just wanted to bring it back and say, what I'm getting out of this, and we talked about tendencies earlier, the feel that I'm getting is a sort of technocratic, democratic socialism. It's like, it seems like that's the only way forward. Like, street movements have a part to play in that, but we have to build up sort of a DSA sort of structure that can then create its own think tanks. It's like it could be like a Jacobin article sort of thing. Do you guys think I'm totally off there, or do you think they kind of, like you said earlier, they were in the Corbyn movement, and I think that makes sense based on what I'm reading here.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they would want to push back. I'm speaking for them just basically because I've read further things and I've worked with them on other projects. Sure. I think they would push back on that and say that they're not advocating some sort of democratic socialist, Jacobin magazine utopian vision, but that would be a potential that would serve to that point of building what was the first point? Building the sort of theoretical foundations,
intellectual infrastructure. Yeah,
the intellectual infrastructure. Because one of the things they build out in their book, Inventing the Future, and they talk about it here, but it was something that helped build up the hegemony of neoliberalism in the middle of the 20th century that's sometimes referred to as the Mont Pelerin Society. And it was a group of philosophers and economists and various other thinkers that strategized long-term strategies alternative to the dominant Keynesian policies that were being implemented at the time, the dominant welfare state, social democratic policies that were taking hold over the West at the time. And then, of course, when a crisis hit in the 70s, then they were perfectly positioned because they'd had all these think tanks, they'd embedded all these academics at university institutions, and they'd worked with political candidates like Ronald Reagan in his gubernatorial administration in California, so that when the perfect time came to ascend to power, all the pieces were in place. And they similarly want to build something for the left. And so I think that they would see their program as being the revolutionary version of that.
Okay.
So I don't know that they're advocating sort of a social democratic or a democratic socialist platform per se, but I think they look at Corbynism, I think they look at momentum in the UK as being necessary but not sufficient, or useful democratic left-wing spaces for the type of deliberation that they initiate in this manifesto to take further hold and then build out from there.
Okay. Yeah, that's actually extremely helpful and clarifies quite a bit. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
I think so. So because I think that they would be very critical of some of the kind of more comfortable positions of social democracy, of just, let's just maintain capital but have a greater redistribution of wealth, a higher tax rate or something like that. I think that they would push back against that very much. But at the same time, I think if you said, hey, if we could implement more Danish political protections into America, Canada, and the UK and France and elsewhere around the world right now, would you be for that? They'd be like, fuck yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's okay, So I think they're trying to, and this goes back to the point that I was talking about earlier, that I think can really be summed up in this binary, this tension that I'm working through with my idealism and then needing to meet real people's needs now. And the Black Panthers talked about this perfectly when Huey Newton summed it up as survival pending revolution. And I think that there's something so important with that, is trying to figure out how to survive while we're also seeking the anti-capitalist or post-capitalist alternative.
Yeah, I think there's a Maoist line here. Obviously, the Black Panthers were incredibly inspired by Mao and the Chinese Revolution, but this idea of, mass work, of applying the mass line, you're serving the people, you're going out and meeting the people's basic needs, but in the process of doing that, you also help raise class consciousness and lay foundations that can later be utilized towards more revolutionary approaches. So it is kind of addressing both at the same time, because whatever tactic you want to take, whatever idea of the future of the left you have, it's certainly going to be dependent on whether or not we can get large chunks of the apolitical or depoliticized masses to align with us or come over to our side of things. Because with the ideology of neoliberalism, with capitalist realism in the minds of so many people, we're having a hard time as the left broadly, the revolutionary left, doing that. And I think mass work, meeting the people, serving the people on the ground is one positive step we can take to bolster that sort of background support that we'll absolutely need if anything is to pop off in the future.
Okay, so I got a question for both of you. It's one question, but it's two-pronged. So in relation to that, and then this kind of fits into something that would be more that I wanted to ask Troy about. So this idea of redefining or re-identifying the proletariat. This is something that Hart and Negri talk about in Empire and in their other works that have kind of come out of that. And a lot of people have found that to be problematic. They want to just, certain more hardline Leninists would say, no, the revolution starts with the working class, and then other people want to say, yeah, but what about black rights? What about gay rights? What about women's rights? What about fucking animal rights? What about ecological concerns? How do we broaden out this idea of the proletariat? Or in our book club, Troy, the idea that Jean-Luc Nancy talks about with and that Prozorov talks about, with this idea of freedom and equality kind of extending to the universe. I mean, we don't really know what it means. So how does that fit in? What do we think about that? And then what that relates to in my question for Troy then is this idea, and then obviously Brett too, but
Sure.
It's the religious question, this idea of like a pluralism, or what I'm thinking in my mind of an ecumenical leftism, which I really like, because I just want people to fucking love each other and come together. and I get really frustrated with Christians who are like ripping each other at the throat. I always was involved in ecumenical Christian thinking and trying to be involved with ecumenical Christian ideas and movements. So I guess those are my questions. What do we think about like the proletariat? Because that fits into this idea of ecumenicalism, of crossing these barriers or kind of eradicating supposed barriers and uniting people into a common cause. How do we understand that in relation to what they're articulating?
Yeah, I would like to hear Troy go first.
I was going to say Brett should go first. Yeah, I mean, I think, me, Austin, I'm really big on universalism.
Right.
And that we need whatever our political program is to have a universalist, essentially be universalist in nature. And so I don't think that's necessarily like anti-Leninist or whatever, but the notion that class conflict goes down to the heart of every human being or whatever, I don't want to push that. I want that to be sort of an analysis of the way society is currently constructed, but doesn't necessarily have to be constructed that way. So for instance, to get away from the theoretical for a second, this is why I think and I think you too, Austin, are so encouraged by Ocasio-Cortez's campaign in New York, because everything that she hasn't been elected yet and hasn't promoted any specific bills yet, the tone of her campaign is so universalist in nature. And you see this in the push for Medicare for all, right? It's sort of, I think, going to be the defining issue of the next election, hopefully at least.
Mm-hmm.
In that, yes, some people are capitalists and some are proletarians, right? But except for a very, very few people, everybody works for somebody else and is exploited by somebody else. And I think if we want to promote a society that's the best possible society, that does mean it's actually best for everybody, right? Including those who we might think are on the wrong side of history currently. And yeah, maybe some guillotines happen in the process, right? But if we really do think it's the best possible society that we want to move towards, whatever that might be, even if we're not sure about the sort of intricacies and nuances of that right now, we do need to promote it as a form of universalism. This is the society that we think is the best that we want to move towards, or at least start moving towards, in whatever sort of little nooks and crannies we can see right now. For instance, a Medicare for all program. And so, yeah, I mean, I really think the idea of moving a little bit more away from the traditional Marxist notion might be helpful given our current circumstances. But yeah, that's a little bit more of the philosophical side, I think, than the strictly political, maybe.
Sure. And I can kind of go off that a little bit and maybe take it in a slightly different direction. This idea, and the phrase they use in the paper is partial proletarian identities. And I think what they're getting at is a critique. People make critiques against sort of crude reductionist Marxism, that it's workerist, that it sort of reduces the complexity of an individual just to their class position, when in reality, not only are we much more, complex beings than that, but there are also other sites of oppression that I think only recently, 50 years or so, have we really started, since the 60s probably in the U.S., have we really started to sort of systematically address those other sites of oppression? And so the way I think about it is kind of juxtaposing what I call socialist or communist intersectional solidarity with liberal identity politics. Liberals, because they lack a class consciousness and they don't want to have one because it's the ideology of capitalism, you'll have this idea where they do value identity and identity politics, and those are sites of oppression that are absolutely real and absolutely important, and you can try to organize around that. But what happens in liberal discourse is identity becomes something that just becomes a bludgeon with which you can hit other people over the head with, because there's no unifying concept. There's no way to unify people across identities. It just becomes an individualist game, and you hear these kind of crude ideas of like quote unquote Olympic suppression, and I don't want to get into that discourse, but there is a certain sort of spinning your wheels in the mud that liberal identity politics offers. And on the other hand, we have what I would call intersectional solidarity, which absolutely 110% acknowledges and strives to understand those other sites of oppression, whether it's gender, whether it's race, ethnic, religious, etc., but then also presents class as a unifying thread through which people can come together across identities and move forward in a coherent way. So that sort of intersectional solidarity gives us a path forward where I think mere identity politics doesn't. And when they say partial proletarian identities, I think it speaks to that complexity of the human being. And if the left wants to organize people in this situation, you have to address those other points of oppression, as well as the more fundamental Marxist critique of class society and the exploitation, etc.
What do you think of the viability of being able to create a pluralism, like an ecumenicalism, of being able to cross all of these divides within these various concerns that seems to hold people back from really cohering kind of around the commonality of class exploitation or something else, maybe the vision of the good, as Troy was kind of hinting at? What do you think? Because it seems like there are some obstacles here, and it's very difficult. People they hunker down into their silos, and whatever their issue is that they're concerned with, that's the thing that 90% of their energy is devoted towards. And not necessarily a bad thing, but I'm just, as someone who is on the ground organizing, do you see these concerns? Are you able to overcome these concerns? What are you hearing? Like, how does that fit into this? Because that's my concern, is is overcoming the restrictions that would lead to the pluralistic orientation that you're advocating.
Right. I think I don't have all the answers, obviously, but when it comes to left-wing organizing, I think it's absolutely essential that we don't spend too much time cutting
On the internet?
Yeah,
No,
well, definitely that, because in real life is way different than the internet. But also, like, just dedicating time to, like, parsing over these differences theoretically between different left factions. While it's important and we do have differences, spending the bulk of your time just hashing them over is super counterproductive. So I kind of think of this idea, and I think they echo it in here when they talk about an ecology of organizations. I call it principled coalitions based around shared interests. So instead of having to water down your line or kind of do the Occupy big tent thing where everybody, even given our differences, is kind of smashed together and like, hopefully this works, it doesn't. The alternative is to, wherever you are on the left, wherever you are in your organizing life, is to find what your values and ideology are at this time, find a group that speaks to those, and then just start doing work on that front. So if you're an anarchist, join Black Rose Anarchist Federation. If you're a Leninist, join PSL. If you're a Democratic Socialist, join DSA, etc., and push forward your project. And they even talk about it in here where, certain movements will have strengths and other ones will have weaknesses, and we can all kind of have a feedback loop where we learn from one another. Oh, the anarchists do this really well. Oh, PSL does this really well. The Maoists are kind of doing some interesting experimentation over here. And I think instead of watering us down into some vague notion of left unity or big tent socialism and opposed to hyper dogmatic sectarianism where we're just cutting each other's throats all the time, there's this middle ground that I think we can all maintain ideological integrity but also work together, because I think it's pretty damn clear, especially here in the U.S., that if we're factionalized, if we're split up, if we're attacking each other, we have no chance of winning. Even if we're a coherent, loving left, we still have huge obstacles to overcome. So I think that might be something that both I agree with and I think this paper echoes.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and it's really the big issue to be addressed, and practical concerns, right? Because in the manifesto, it's stated that they want to avoid the folk politics, which usually ends up with that sectarian infighting, right? Because you have a bunch of local groups who are just doing their own thing, and they either never talk, or when they do, they fight over their minimal differences. And instead, accelerationism wants to move towards actually seizing the sort of technological means of production in a way through things like finance and complexity theory and whatnot. And so, how do you go about doing that without already having a somewhat unified group, right? Mass group,
right.
Mass movement.
Right.
Do you think that this is kind of a bringing back of the Logos into mythos? This is like connecting us to the good, that this is almost part of the reason that the left is so fractured is because there is no transcendence. There is no beyond. It's just pure brute materiality, and not in the good historical materialist sense. Because historical materialism was never meant to be some sort of just animalistic, seek your own pleasures and be content with that. It has a completely different orientation, a completely different motive. So is this, I don't know, I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and I one of the dudes in my department here, he's Iranian, so he has a deep attachment to both Sufi and Shia Islam, but he's really interested in Sufi Islam. And we've been talking a lot about just the degradation of transcendence. And even though I am some form of materialist or immanentist or whatever, I mean, I'll let other people tell me what they think I am. I just fucking talk. But I think that if we lose our ability to find that beyond that is in our midst, then I think that goes a long way in leading to that fracturing. And this is one of the things that we've talked about with Prozorov's book that we'll wrap up next week, is this idea of grounding a universal politics on a universalist ontology that circumvents both the kind of old nihilisms of modernity and then the nihilisms of post-modernity, and it advocates something else. And so do you think that there's like a need to reclaim transcendence here, or the good, or the beyond, or something?
Well, I mean, it's tough because the very notion of capitalist realism, the very notion of being a neoliberal subject is to be so hyper individualistic that it kind of works against that unifying notion of something that's transcendent. But at the same time, people certainly, whether they know it or not, yearn for it. I certainly
Right.
do. I have my own mechanisms by which I try to reach out to something beyond myself. So I don't have the answer there, but I think it does speak to a topic that I wanted to get into with you guys, and it speaks to this notion of the Enlightenment. In this paper, they talk about the Enlightenment. They talk about sort of completing the Enlightenment project of collective self-mastery, and maybe that bumps up against your ideas of the transcendent and the Enlightenment project broadly, and the sort of synthesis between logos and mythos. How do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a good point, I think, because I mean, I definitely stand on the idea that there's something that's transcendent that we would have to reach that can help sort of ground that universality that's necessary for any sort of mass movement to actually take hold. And so maybe something analogous to the Enlightenment search, it wouldn't exactly be that, right? Because we know that in a lot of cases, the Enlightenment search for transcendence ends up with a very particular form of hegemony, right?
Right.
But maybe more analogous to that in the sense that we want to find something that can sort of universalize humanity and give us the grounds for which to then form a unity. And what that is, I don't know, but the stance maybe is the most important thing. So maybe we could consider it something like a curious, investigative humility towards transcendence. Not saying, here it is, I have it, everybody accept it, or, you're dead, or you're an idiot, or you're whatever else. But instead say, if we all have the stance of seeking that same thing, that's almost the same thing as having it.
Right.
Right? Because, I mean, if you already had it, then we'd kind of be done with life. Like, what would be the point?
Right.
So instead, if we're all sort of seekers together, even if we're not sure what that is, and if we're all humble enough to admit that the other person who's also in a good faith journey for that goal knows as much as I do, and I'm not in any way special compared to them, that seems to me to at least provide maybe at least the effective basis for forming that left unity.
I really like that. I think that they fleshed that out more in the book Inventing the Future with the term hyperstitional. Yeah, Troy?
Yeah, exactly.
The idea of hyperstitionality is it's the future projection of the image that you don't really know what it is, but it's an orientation to the future that is radically open, and you create the future in the projection of the future. And it's almost this performative, open collection that allows you to be sensitive to recognizing that, hey, that image that we just projected like 2 years ago, we got to refine that shit.
Right.
Because it's not quite meeting the material needs in the present. Or even the image that we just projected now, we're going to need to refine it in a month from now because more people are going to tell us, hey, you forgot about this, or here's a new crisis that we're facing, or whatever. And I like it. What did you call it, Troy? It was perfect the way you phrased it. A curious what?
Oh, the curious, investigative humility.
Fucking A, I love it.
It's your chi, dude.
Oh, yeah?
I like that a lot.
A curious. Oh, I said it wrong. CIH.
A curious, investigative humility. I love that idea.
I like that. And I think we have the power to inject that into discourse on an individual level. When we're engaging with other people, we can sort of, try to not just tell people to do it, but to lead by example and do it ourselves. And in this paper, they talk about the importance of experimentation and this idea that we don't have all the answers. We don't know exactly where things are headed. As much as people like to posture and pretend that they have all the answers, we really don't. And so that epistemic humility and that openness to experimentation, I think, is crucial and ultimately going to be beneficial and maybe work towards that sort of unifying, transcendent concept.
Are there any major concerns that you had, Brett, that you would really want to either see how they develop further or how we can think through things further that were kind of like that really hit you?
Well, first, can I just talk a little bit more about the Enlightenment really quick?
Yeah, please. I'm sorry.
I really like this idea of completing the Enlightenment project in a way, and you guys might not totally be on board with this, but I view kind of three types of more or less anti-Enlightenment thinking that I see at play right now in our culture. One is obvious, which is, the sort of postmodern approach. The other one I think is like fascistic and theocratic myth making, the Jordan Peterson type. This Nazism was obsessed with occultism, and fascism is rooted in sort of conspiratorial thinking or irrationality at some level. And those two are obvious, but I think the third one is like perpetuated by people like Sam Harris or Steven Pinker and even Jordan Peterson to an extent, which is this neoliberal centrism that claims itself as the carriers of the Enlightenment project. And whereas the original Enlightenment project was about, disrupting the hierarchies of power in the society of feudal times, it's sort of been perverted to now be a weapon that people like those people in the center use to maintain the status quo. And I think as communists or as leftists, we could make this argument, which I think is kind of here in the paper, that says that no, the Enlightenment's not completed. It was a sort of bastardized version rooted in exploitation and colonialism at the time of its birth, and now centrists are using it to maintain the status quo. But the spirit of the Enlightenment, which is that we can sort of take control over our own lives and that we can challenge and constantly question the hierarchies that we were born into, that's actually a left-wing project. That's not the project of the liberals and the centrists. And so I think there's something, interesting there. What are your thoughts?
So much amen to that.
Yeah.
We agree then.
Absolutely. The Enlightenment is so variegated, so much more so than its current champions would normally tell you, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's almost like Hume never happened in the Enlightenment.
Right. Right.
About if Hume were around today, he'd be called a postmodernist by Pinker et al.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah, so it's very much more a spirit than it is a specific set of doctrines or a specific governing style or epistemology or whatever else.
Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. I like to think of it as a sort of orientation or a dispositional framework. It's the way that you reorient to the structures of the world, you reorient to nature. It changes your focus and it changes your directionality.
Yeah.
And I think that if I do have a concern with this idea of reclaiming the Enlightenment or repurposing the Enlightenment or harnessing the spirit of the Enlightenment, it's in this notion of hegemony that I'm not comfortable with. And this is something that I'm really curious to hear what Alex has to say in his new book, which he's been working on for a few years now, which is the outworking of this idea of advocating for a counter-hegemony. So his new book is going to be called Hegemony Now. And the thing is that I am concerned with the logic of hegemony itself because I think it's essentially contractualist. It's essentially something that erects dividing lines. It creates an inside and an outside. It creates a natural versus unnatural, a civil versus uncivil. And that's not something that can be circumvented with some sort of like nice hegemony, because hegemony is essentially doing that. It's just doing it in a different way. So if hegemony now is, and I don't mean the title of the book, but I mean currently, if current hegemony is a sort of neoliberal, global financialized understanding of capitalism and then all the attendant logics and cultural orientations that come along with that, counter-hegemony would be, I don't know, the realization of kind of the program that they're talking about here, for example. Some sort of institution of a hegemonic, revolutionary political system, something where humans are able to self-actualize, where the tools of technology are used for the new proletariat, where climate change is taken seriously, or whatever. There's a universal basic income, there's a diminishing of the work week, something like that. And those things programmatically, I'm not opposed to, obviously, at all. My concern is do they need to be understood within this logic of hegemony? Because, yeah, go ahead, Troy.
No, sorry, I thought you were.
No, I'm done. I'm me. I'll just keep fucking rambling.
I'm wondering is your worry about, I have pulled up here, paragraph 13 of chapter 3, and I put a big question mark next to this because it seemed like something to worry about. And they say, the overwhelming privileging of democracy as process needs to be left behind. The fetishization of openness, horizontality, and inclusion of much of today's radical left set the stage for ineffectiveness. And this is the main line: secrecy, verticality, and exclusion all have their place as well in effective political action.
I like that line.
I put
I worry about that. Okay, Brett, why do you like it?
Because I think, at least the way I interpreted it, is that this openness and this horizontalism and this ultimate inclusion it sort of results in what I think of as the Occupy experiment. This attempt to do consensus decision making. Everybody's welcome. Everybody has an equal voice. And while that might be nice and it has some benefits, ultimately the failure of Occupy points to the failure of this sort of tactic. And so that's a part of it. We can have that stuff, but it also when it's inherently juxtaposed to these other forms of organizing, it limits itself and it limits what the left can do. So I think they're arguing for an organizational structure that wouldn't necessarily cohere with the anarchist, horizontalist, occupyist ideas of how to organize and build society.
Okay, so they set up a binary here. It's openness, horizontality, and inclusion versus secrecy, verticality, and exclusion. Can I tell you what I would like to offer?
Yes, please.
Openness, verticality, and inclusion.
Okay. I see.
What do you, because that's my concern. It's the secrecy and the exclusion that I worry about.
Right.
And I wonder, can we not circumvent the folk politics? What did you call it? The Occupy?
Yeah, like the Occupy mindset, the Occupy organizational structure. Yeah.
Could we not circumvent the sort of impermanence of that? I'm sorry, the impermanence of that, the sort of temporality of that, and the temporary autonomous zone mindset. Can we not circumvent that by still advocating some sort of macro political or vertical programmatic building, still working towards taking state power? Can we not have that, but also openness and inclusion?
Yeah, so this could be an entire episode in itself. I think that part of the reason that I kind of identify towards the Marxist-Leninist Maoist position is that I think Mao was experimenting with trying to bring these two things together, where he saw the Soviet Union and he saw how a bureaucracy was kind of formed and it was sort of cut off from the people and it formed its own interest. And so Mao was like, how can we have the best of a planning, of a party, of vanguardism, but also account for some of its failures that we saw in the Soviet Union? And that was like, the Cultural Revolution, the mass line, this idea that it's top down and it's bottom up. Obviously, ultimately, Mao died and China went its own path, etc. But in the spirit of experimenting with this stuff, I really like that. And when he says secrecy and exclusion, those are buzzwords and they're very loaded. And because they don't exactly explain it, I think we can all we orient ourselves to those words differently. For me, secrecy and exclusion means we don't let anybody into the organization that just wants to join for whatever reason. That opens you up to a whole bunch of weak points. And at some point, we have to sort of keep things in-house so as not to let our political enemies or those that would like to destroy us, be so open that they can just have that open shot to take us down. And so to me, it was more like a tactical party building aspect that I read those words as, whereas I think you were kind of seeing it as like more of secret, groups of leaders and excluding people that we don't like, etc. I don't know.
Well, I think you're partly right, and it's that especially that last bit, the excluding people we don't like bit that I don't like with the language of exclusion. But I think even more than that, I still have an affinity for some of the approaches of Jesus, and it's the idea of sitting at the dinner table with your enemy, and it's the idea of embracing the prostitute and the tax collector and the banker. And I don't mean accepting everything that they do or that they stand for or that they advocate or that they engage in. Of course not. But I don't know, and this is just a personal journey that, ask me in 5 years where I am on this. I have no clue. But I'm still really attached to that idea of the transformative possibility of embrace.
Yeah, so I agree with you, and I have those impulses as well. For me, my big holding back is that in reality, we're not talking about maybe the tax collector or the prostitute in Jesus' time, but we're talking about the hard-nosed capitalist who refuses to give an inch and literal fascists who want to cut our throats the moment they get a chance. And so for me, that is the ultimate goal. That's the ultimate goal, is to the very people that are locked inside this system and that are reactionaries now in a different socio-economic environment could very well not have those horrible, aspects to them. But in the meantime, they're not going to sit down at a table with us and let them talk to them. They're going to kill us if they get the chance. And so that makes me want to put my guard up and say, yeah, eventually that's where we want to get. In the meantime, we have a lot of fucking fighting to do. And that's going to be that's going to take tactical, strategic, maneuvering to keep those people out, keep them at a distance, defend ourselves, etc.
Yeah, I guess to keep using the Jesus metaphor, you're talking about the sort of anger, the Pharisees, right? Yeah, the anger that he had to the Pharisees, and when he goes into the temple and he turns over the fucking table of the money changers. You're talking about them as being the fascists and the hard-nosed capitalists, but the embrace of the other is just the embrace of those who have been excluded. It's not just a willy-nilly hippie, hey, everybody come and join us, and everyone has a free contribution. Tommy Robinson, you're an advocate of free fucking speech, motherfucker. No, it's not that.
Okay.
Yeah, the important point, I think, is the fetishization is the problem, right?
Yeah.
I mean, openness, horizontality, and inclusion aren't sort of in and of themselves bad. It's the assumption that by structuring ourselves in such a way, we will automatically win. And that's sort of like the bad theology, right? Which is, if we just martyr ourselves, everyone will see that and then we'll win. It's also how the civil rights movement has been recast in history and taught to students today, right? Which is, if you just get your asses beat in public, all the nice white people will see it and feel bad for you and then change their minds.
Right.
Which is obviously not how the civil rights movement actually happened, right? And so that's like the bad Christianity, the bad theology version of it. And I think they're right to point out that fetishization of methods like that is unhelpful and unproductive. If they want to talk about it more as strategic, I'm okay with that. There probably is a place for things like secrecy and exclusion, right? But then I would worry, and maybe whatever our governing vision is in the end, the thing we're trying to get to, that wouldn't have exclusion as a constitutive part of it. Whereas the sort of means to get there might, right?
Right.
In the same way that Jesus was saying to the Pharisees, you're whitewashed tombs, you've sinned against the Holy Spirit, there's no place for you in the kingdom. But then at the same time advocating for a universalist message, which is, in the end, everybody is equal and everybody's together.
Yeah, because what he's saying is that they actually weren't embodying a universalist message. So
yeah, they were in bad faith.
They were in bad faith. Yeah. So all right, I'm with you. Hegemony now. No, yeah. No, I'm really curious to see what that book says, because I wonder how he would frame that. But again, I that's still just something, that I'm always. I read a book by John Beasley Murray called Post Hegemony, and I've been really influenced by like Gilles Deleuze, and so of the sort of like post the designations that you gave earlier, Brett, I would be kind of more in that postmodern, post-structuralist. I mean, I don't like those terms, the way that they're bandied about usually, but I've been very influenced by postmodern critics, the Jean Baudrillards, the Gilles Deleuze, Irigaray, Jacques Lacan, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah. So I do tend to have more leanings that would orient me to the horizontalism that they're critical of, but at the same time wanting to bridge that with a verticalism. And it's just finding, I guess, the balance between the two that I'm struggling through.
For sure.
In a good way. Not like help me, but like that this is what philosophy and this is what activism, this is the marriage of theory and praxis. This is a good thing,
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're not going through it, then something's wrong.
Right. Yeah. You're certain. Again, problem with certainty. Okay, cool. So let's kind of wrap things up. Final thoughts, guys. What are you thinking?
Well, just for my orientation, I like a lot of what they're saying. I think there's a strategy and an outlook here that's important and valuable. I think we'd all benefit from wrestling with it. There are some things that I don't agree with, and more than that, though, I think there's some things that I just wish were more fleshed out. And perhaps if I read their full book or was able to sit down with them and talk to them, I would be able to get that. Of course, a manifesto, just by virtue of what it is limited, and they can't flesh out every single point and make every definition clear, etc. So that's kind of where I am with it. My final fear would be, I do take this idea, this sort of Maoist idea, that a revolution in the base is essential, but there also has to be a revolution in the superstructure itself. And there's a consciousness, a consciousness embedded in us that will last even in a transitionary period to socialism. And we've seen how that has derailed socialist projects in the past. And so I wonder, along with this organizational structure and altering the base and taking these productive technological forces and putting them towards a communist project, how do we address the ideological side, the ideological hangovers from capitalism? How do we address, forces of capitalism or reaction even in a transitionary state, or even the little reactionaries and capitalists we have in our minds just by virtue of being conditioned in this society? So that's part of the puzzle that I'd like to see, more fleshed out and more addressed, and one of the things I think might be a weakness if it's not fully confronted.
Yeah, I think that's really good. Thank you, Brett. I would also agree that I think this has been a very helpful read and a helpful discussion about the manifesto, and sort of figuring out where the points of agreement are and where the points of, hey, we still need to sort of figure this out and keep talking. And that seems to me the fruits of any helpful conversation, right? Come to some conclusions about some things, and some areas where you're still not sure and you need to investigate further.
Yeah.
So we have just instantiated an element of the intellectual infrastructure that they advocate. This is it, man. We're realizing point one of their manifesto.
And then,
we've seized the means of podcast production.
I was about to say, the moment that you release this, we'll also have started to address their second concrete stage, which is media reform and investing in that communication. Yeah, so we're hitting all syllables.
What was the third one? How do we get there?
Class power. That's the tough one, right?
And that's why you need to tune in to Brett's podcast, because that's shit. Hey, plug your cast so people can find out where to listen to you.
Yeah, again, it's Revolutionary Left Radio and The Guillotine. You can find them on iTunes. You can find them on the Stitcher app. We're trying to expand platforms. I think TuneIn just recently picked up RevLeft Radio. If you Google either RevLeft Radio or The Guillotine, we're sure to come up. And thank you guys so much for having me on. I love the show. I love this conversation. And let's collaborate more in the future, because I think we have a lot more we can talk about.
Absolutely, brother. No, thank you for coming on, man.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that our podcast isn't a political podcast per se. It's more of a philosophy podcast, right?
Yep.
We are philosophers more than anything. And one of the things I really like about your work is that you kind of, if the joke is the philosophers' heads are in the clouds, your feet are firmly on the ground, but you also look up into the sky a lot,
Yeah,
and I really like that, because it helps me, especially the guillotine. The guillotine, if I want to get angry or sad about what's going on in the news, but also get a little bit of inspiration and teary-eyed because of the hope that you guys are trying to work through, the guillotine is the one for that one. You get me sometimes, brother. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate you. Thank you for those kind words. Love and solidarity.
All right, so our next segment is the Sticky Leaves segment. This is where one of us talks about whatever it is that's bringing us meaning in a meaningless world. Austin, what's your Sticky Leaves this week?
I like mixed martial arts. That's what my Sticky Leaves is this week. And more than that, it's that there is a fight this weekend that I think is the perfect exemplar of the beauty of mixed martial arts as a discipline, or as a sport, or whatever the fuck you want to call it, as a series of disciplines that have been turned into a sport. But basically, there's a fight between a guy, and now people that are listening right now that are like, fuck this, sports again, I'm tuning out. Just bear with me for a second. Let me give my my wanky spiritual defense of the art that is mixed martial arts. So there's a fight this weekend between these two former rivals. It's TJ Dillashaw and a guy named Cody Garbrandt. Cody Garbrandt was the champion. TJ Dillashaw beat him, and now they're rematching. There's a lot of backstory, a lot of like bullshit drama and stuff. They used to be part of the same fight camp, and TJ Dillashaw was perceived to be a sort of snake, and he kind of undercut some expectations within the camp, and blah, blah, blah. It doesn't matter. Human drama shit, right? That really helped build up the rivalry for the first fight, which was a really good fight, although relatively short. It ended in the second round with TJ Dillashaw knocking out Cody Garbrandt and becoming the new champion, or I should say reclaiming his title, because he was the champion a few years ago. But now there's the rematch. The drama isn't quite the same now. It's just about who really was the better fighter, because they are generally perceived as being rather equal. But that's not the thing that's really interesting to me. The thing that's really interesting to me is that these dudes are unique specimen within the world of mixed martial arts. So when you watch them fight, when you watch them engage in their dance of pugilism, they do it in a way that is so unique and so different. I mean, I think so many people think of like fighting or boxing, and they think of like dudes, aggression, wanting to just punch people and hurt people. And sure, there is an element of that, obviously. We can't deny that. You know, you look at Mike Tyson and you're like, he's angry and he's foul and he just hurt people. Yeah, he was a fucking badass dude, man. He was a bad dude. But I think there's something more to that mixed martial arts offers. And it really is a sort of holistic understanding that kind of pushes beyond the limits of human physicality, right? And these two fighters, partly because of their size, because smaller fighters tend to have more mobility, more flexibility, more agility, more speed, and then also just because of their history. They both have wrestling backgrounds, you know, like a collegiate, or I think Cody has a high school, not collegiate, but TJ has a collegiate amateur wrestling background. They have an athleticism mixed with all those other attributes that they have that really that kind of gives them a lot of advantages to be able to become excellent martial artists. And then on top of that, you take the years and years and years and years of training in these various disciplines of martial arts. You've got Muay Thai, you've got boxing, you've got Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, you've got the continual training in wrestling, you've got other things like probably Kali Salat and Savat and all of these various other disciplines that would be incorporated into their techniques. And you get these two athletes who engage in a crazy, like physically violent dance with one another that at the surface level, it might seem like chaos or just dudes punching each other. But when you really start to get into the flows of their dance, I think you really can appreciate what this sport can be, what this sport ought to be at its highest levels. So that's all I want to say is this weekend, and I'm so stoked on this fight, man. It's Saturday night, LA or American time, so I'll be watching it Sunday morning at like 10 or 11 or whatever it is. But I cannot wait for it, man. The footwork in this fight, the level of technical proficiency is so interesting. So real quick, before I let you talk, so Cody Garbrandt, he won the title from a former champion by the name of Dominic Cruz, who I actually was working on a documentary with Dominic Cruz when I was in LA a couple of years ago. And Dominic is generally known as being a very cerebral fighter. He's very intelligent. He's got amazing footwork. He's a commentator for the sport. He is just a very kind of well-rounded personality within the sport, right? So one of the things that he was talking about when he was fighting Cody was that Cody was an idiot. Cody's like a bit of a lughead, was Dominic Cruz's argument. He's a bit of a moron. He's just this jock dude that's like, you know? And to be honest, Cody is not the most articulate dude. But I remember watching the fight with him and Dominic Cruz, and I said, Cody may not be able to dissect the Accelerationist Manifesto in the same way that we just did with Brett. That may not be his vibe. That may not be how he views the world. But he has an intelligence. And I know people talk about fight IQ, but it's more than that. He has a physical intelligence that you see when he's fighting that is so proficient that it's still something that I can admire. It's like watching a top-level basketball player or a top-level ballerina or listening to a top-level opera singer. There is a physical intelligence in the mastery of their instrument that just comes shining through. And even though you listen to Cody talk and you're like, you know, go to school, kids, at the same time, I actually think he's a fucking genius. I really do. He's just a genius in other ways. If there are multiple intelligences, his intelligence is just funneled in a different direction. And then I think Dillashaw as well is a genius. So I think that this fight is going to be fucking amazing to see two genius artists, pugilists battle it out. And I can't wait.
So a couple questions. Yeah. One.
Did I sell you? Are you in? Come on.
Well, let's see. Hold on. I got my questions first. Okay. In the communist utopia, will there be MMA?
See, this is the thing, because then I also have that streak of pacifism in me, right? But here's how I justify it to myself. I'm a pacifist with regards to war, But when it comes to sport, I'm okay with a little bit. Sometimes, yeah, I dated a girl whose dad was from Texas, and he was a farmer in his younger years. And I remember that, whenever like family gatherings would happen and various people would bring their dogs over, there were little dogs that were like foo-foo-y dogs and stuff like that. And people would want to protect their dogs from the other dogs. And the dad would always be like, guys, they're dogs. Just let them figure it out. I think there's something valuable in that. You gotta, if they bark at each other, if they bite each other, guys, they're dogs. They'll figure it out. Just let them go. That's the communist utopia. Guys, we'll figure it out. We're going to have struggles and tensions, and if you need to punch each other or you need to engage in some sort of athletic activity, then, we'll figure it out.
So it's like throw down your swords and plowshares, or like lion and the lamb will sit next to each other, and then they'll fight just for the fuck of it.
Well, not the lion and the lamb, because they just don't have the same weapons. So the lion and the lamb will bet on their lion friends fighting or their lamb friends fighting.
Okay, that's more like a dynamic rather than a literal translation. But
yeah,
I'll go with it.
Okay.
And then second thing was, so would you say that is it Cody Garbrandt? Garbrandt?
Yep.
That he's kind of like, I'm thinking as an analogy to Larry Bird, who was one of the most gifted basketball players in history as far as the way he navigated basketball intelligently, right?
Yes.
If you watch him on the court, you might think this guy is a basketball genius, right? But then you listen off the court, and he's the heck from French Lick.
Yeah.
He's just kind of a simple mind. No, he's not a dumb guy, but he's just kind of a simple guy who's not super depthful, right?
Yeah. And even if you ask
or if he is, he's not showing it.
Yeah, and even if you tried to ask him, like, can you philosophize about basketball? You would feel that everything he said was only like a fraction of what he demonstrates on the court. That somehow, like, he doesn't even understand with like reflective consciousness. It's just become this instinctual intelligence.
Yeah, I get that. And that certainly vibes with the idea I certainly agree with, that there's multiple intelligences. And if intelligence is simply the ability to solve problems, you can do that in ways that are reflective and ways that are not. So I vibe with that.
Yeah. And
I fucks with that.
And mixed martial arts is about problem solving. It is a chess game to the max, and each of the disciplines is its own chess game. Jiu-jitsu itself is a fucking complex chess game. Muay Thai is a complex chess game. Wrestling is a complex chess game. You throw them together and you get like 4-dimensional chess or whatever the fuck it's called. 3-dimensional chess? What's it called?
Yeah, 3-dimensional chess.
Yeah, you get that shit. And that's what it is. It's 3-dimensional chess while people are punching you in the face, and then your adrenaline's flowing, and you still have to be able to outmaneuver the person. And it really is something beautiful. Now, the thing that frustrates me about the way that mixed martial arts is billed a lot of times is it's billed as like the battle to like the battle between the dudes, or whatever. And they've tried to get away from that a little bit. The earlier days, it was worse, right? It was much more, in their promotion, it was much more testosterone fueled, and it still is. But at the same time, I think people are starting to realize the artistry in it. The problem is now it's also declining in ratings. But I think it's for other reasons. It's because of, it's bought by a Hollywood company now. WME owns it, and they're, trying to do these like big blockbuster shows rather than really pitting the best people against each other. But still, the sport, I just think, is so it's so interesting, and sometimes I get burned out on it, and then sometimes a fight like this comes along and I get rekindled again, because they are just both such technicians, and it's seeing two artists out there and it's not even like who has more punching power and who is the better striker or who has better wrestling. Like, those things matter, but it's more who is better in, because at that level it's like it's like 1A and 1B, and we don't know. Maybe if they fought 10 times it would be 5-5. We don't know, but at least right now it's like who is able to tap into the flow better. That's the person that's going to win.
Okay, I'll buy the idea that MMA has artistry to it, and that's kind of like a ballet and all that. That makes sense to me. Can we agree that American football still sucks ass and it's just a bunch of brutes running into each other?
Oh, I feel like this is a sticky leaves that's coming in a couple of months when the season starts. My defense of my love for Tom Brady, the most beautiful man in the world.
Oh my God. Was it that, I think I saw a headline that Trump had hoped that Ivanka was going to marry Tom Brady?
Because they'd have beautiful babies, but instead she's with dickbag.
Yeah, what do you think would have happened if? What alternate reality would that have been?
I don't know. What hell would we?
Could Tom Brady have brought peace to the Middle East with that hair?
I don't know, man. Can they get on board with American football and the Dream Team and the Gronk and all the other pieces that go along with Tom Brady greatness? I don't know.
Yeah, I think it would have made it worse.
Yeah, probably.
That's my feeling.
All right. Thank you so much, guys, for tuning in this week. Remember, you can hit us up on Twitter, owls_at_dawn. You can email us, owlsatdawnpodcast@gmail.com. Hit us up on Facebook. It's just search Owls at Dawn. I think the actual name on Facebook is Owls at Dawn Podcast. Go to our Patreon if you want access to the bonus material as well as the newsletter. What am I missing? iTunes?
Go on iTunes. Drop us a 5-star rating and review if you can. We'd certainly appreciate it.
Yeah, that actually really does help, apparently, with like the algorithms and kind of pushing us up so that people can find us if people search for philosophy or politics or whatever. So if you could just take 2 minutes and just leave us a nice rating and a review, that would actually really help.
Or take 2 hours and hack iTunes and just put us on the top of the list. We'd appreciate that too.
Yeah. Either way,
We don't
mad
give a
love.
Fuck.
All right, what else we got to do, brother?
Just one more thing.
What up?
Das Vidania, Amerikanski.